Are we on? Good. Yeah, so welcome to our tutorial on deep learning for brain encoding and decoding. I'm very, very happy to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us in person, and for everybody online also.
We'll get started. I'll get started with the first part. Recall that this is a beginner part. So some of these things that you will see, I'm trying to be, trying to balance it out between core NLP folks and the core neuroscience folks. So this is a sort of a beginner stuff for which will be relevant to both the communities nicely. Yeah. So I'll start with introduction to brain encoding and decoding, and then I'll talk next about stimulus representations. We will have some theory there as well as some setup time for hands-on, and then do some basic representations using Jupyter notebooks. Yeah. Okay. In the first part, let's get started with the first part. In the first part, I'll talk about brain encoding, decoding, what are the main techniques and research goals. Then I'm also going to talk about popular data sets. So, and across different kinds of modalities like text, visual, audio, or multimodal, right? So let's start with the first part. And so that's that. Neuroscience as a field is a field of science that studies the structure and function of nervous system of different species, particularly humans. Right? It involves answering very, very interesting questions. In fact, these are some of the questions that that a kid has in mind when they essentially start understanding science, right? How learning occurs during adolescence and how it differs the way adults learn and from memories. These days, in fact, I sort of think about it when my kid is learning. So when she's learning, I'm actually trying to observe by in actual senses and experience them. But of course, in neuroscience, you try to understand and correlate them with how the measurements are done using fMRIs and so on. Yeah? Which specific cells in the brain and what connections they form with other cells have a role in how memories are formed. How animals cancel out irrelevant information arriving from the senses and focus only on the information that matters. How do humans make decisions? Of course, very complex, but then, of course, at different levels, people have been trying to understand as part of neuroscience, how do humans make decisions? How humans develop speech and learn languages? Now, I think all of these are very, very interesting questions to introspect and understand how our brain works. Neuroscientists study, of course, diverse topics, many, many diverse topics that help us understand how the brain and nervous system work. Yeah. So that's broadly neuroscience. Now, as part of understanding this, two processes are super important. One is called brain encoding, the other is called brain decoding. Now, encoding is the process of learning the mapping function E from the stimuli S to the neural activation F. So the idea is that you have a stimuli, let's say a picture of a dog, and you want to sort of understand that, hey, if I show this thing to a human, how will the brain respond? So which particular voxels in the brain are essentially activated, and what is the magnitude, and so on. Yeah. So this particular function, learning this function, is actually called as brain encoding, and the function you call it as E. Yeah. So now you could basically do this encoding by trying to first extract some features out of these pictures, and then learn some models so as to predict the voxel magnitudes and so on. Or you could use deep learning directly so as to take the raw input and actually do the encoding part. Right? So that's encoding. Now the other process, the reverse process, is actually called decoding. So decoding therefore constitutes learning mapping D, which sort of predicts the stimuli back from the original brain activation F. Now, this sort of seems like magic. So the idea is that, yes, if I basically know the activations of the brain voxels for this particular human, can I sort of use those activations so as to understand what he's thinking, he or she is thinking, right? Of course, what they are seeing, what they are hearing, or what they're experiencing, and so on. Now, that seems so interesting, right? So that's the basic interesting aspect of neuroscience. This particular function technically is called as, or this particular way of doing things is called as brain decoding. And encoding and decoding are the basics of cognitive neuroscience, are the basic fundamentals of cognitive neuroscience. Besides this, folks also try to do other kinds of encoding decoding. For example, trying to map a particular behavior to how these voxels and their magnitudes change, right? Map participants' behavior to neural variables, or in other ways, also mapping neural variables in one part of the brain to neural variables in the other part of the brain. So that's also a part of encoding decoding. However, of course, the applications for the A and the D part are super high, right? So that's that. For both encoding and decoding, the first step is to really learn a stimulus representation. So whatever the stimulus, whether it is an image or a text or audio or a video, the idea is to sort of learn a representation of the stimuli S at the train time. And then you clearly want to use these representations so as to predict. For encoding, you want to use them to predict the brain response F, right? For encoding, well, the idea is that you want to train a regression function, which basically maps R to F, where R is the stimulus representation, and F is the final set of variables, neural variables that you want to predict. Okay. That's encoding. Now, on the other hand, decoding is basically the reverse function. So you basically have those neural variables, and you want to sort of guess what this guy was looking at, right? What this person was looking at. And therefore, you want to guess R. Now, in some ways, trying to exactly get the stimulus seems to be a far-fetched goal in some ways, with a very, very high accuracy. So being able to reconstruct the video that this person was looking at, or being able to reconstruct the image that this person was looking at, is of course possible, right, to a certain extent. But what is commonly observed and what people commonly do is to learn a representation R of the stimuli rather than actually guessing the original image or the text or the original paragraph and so on, right? So these functions E and D can then be used at the test time to process new stimuli or the new brain activations, as the case may be. So that's brain encoding and decoding. Now, to be able to do this, you have to, of course, have brain recordings, right? And there are several ways of having brain recordings. Many multiple ways as they are being shown in this chart, right? So 7 of them have been shown here. Some of them are invasive, some of them are non-invasive. Of course, people prefer non-invasive techniques these days. Yeah. And these techniques sort of differ in their temporal resolution and spatial resolution, right? Of course, you would want to have a technique which has a very awesome temporal resolution, can sort of discriminate between very, very minute things, right? And also very awesome spatial resolution. But there is a trade-off, right? But there's a good trade-off across different techniques. Now, what is popular is fMRI. fMRI, as you can see here, has high spatial correlation, has high spatial resolution, but low time resolution. Now, the high spatial resolution makes sure that you can discriminate between very, very small places, small locations inside the brain, and therefore it's good to study a specific location in the brain. However, it is unsuitable for sentence level analysis. Now, and the reason is fMRI sort of takes about 2 seconds to complete a scan, while this is far lower than the reading speed, right? So therefore, reading speed and processing language and so on. And therefore, it's sort of unsuitable for sentence level analysis. Cannot capture the syntactic information very well. Now, on the other hand, you have EEG, which basically has high time resolution, but low spatial resolution, which basically means that it can actually preserve syntactic information, very rich syntactic information, but cannot be used for source analysis, unlike fMRIs. Yeah. As a trade-off, in some ways, you have NIRS and fNIRS, right, which is a compromise option. So where the time resolution is surely better than fMRIs and spatial resolution is better than EEG, and therefore, it's sort of a good balance between the two. However, many times people think that while trying to strike this balance, it cannot compensate for the loss in both of them. So that's that. So basically, you can still study the cortical areas, but cannot study the subcortical areas. Yeah. fMRIs, most of us will be familiar how fMRIs are done, but then this is what it is. No injections, no surgery, non-invasive completely, right? And there's also no exposure to ionizing radiation at all. The primary form of fMRI, called as the bold, it uses the bold contrast, and this is a technique which was discovered way back in 1990. It measures brain activity by detecting changes in the blood flow. So the idea is that whenever brain needs to, particular parts of the brain need to be active and involved in the processing, there's a lot of blood flow that happens there. And by measuring the flow of the blood in various parts of the brain, you can actually figure out if there is a good amount of brain activity happening in that part of the brain. Yeah. However, there is a time delay. So essentially, it takes a while for our blood system, the vascular system, to respond to the brain's need for glucose. And therefore, when you're trying to measure these things, you have to incorporate for this delay nicely. Now, that is technically called as the hemodynamic response, or the HRF function. And that's sort of used to take care of this lag between between the blood flow and the brain response. Yeah, it's about 5 seconds. It's about more or less 5 seconds, but clearly it differs for different parts of the brain. Now, what are the primary goals that the current form of research in this field, computational cognitive science, is doing? It's what are the form of questions that people are trying to answer? So one of the form of question, one of the things is predictive accuracy. So people want to have as high encoding and decoding accuracy as possible. And therefore, people are trying different kinds of features. So depending on the kind of stimuli, you have different kinds of features, whether it is visual, linguistic, and so on stimuli. Yeah. So which particular feature space gives you the best accuracy? Also test feature decodability in the sense that does a neural data Y contain information about certain kinds of features? So for better understanding of the language, does part of speech tagging matter? Questions of that kind. Yeah. Build accurate models of brain data, so and therefore be able to have accurate encoding and decoding. So that's one of the goals: predictive accuracy, improving predictive accuracy. Yeah. The other goal is interpretability. Clearly, even in basic machine learning, deep learning for other kinds of purposes, you of course want to have high accuracy, but at the same time you want to understand, right? Why? So interpretability. And therefore, in the feature engineering part of computational cognitive science, interpretability is super high in terms of determining which features contribute the most to neural activity, and feature importance analysis and things of that kind. You can also do correspondences between different representation spaces, so CNNs versus ventral visual stream. How do they compare? Which layers correspond to different levels in the visual cortex hierarchy? Okay, or even comparing to text representations. So that's the other kind of interpretability. Interpret feature sets. So do features X, which are generated by a particular process, accurately describe the brain response? Do voxels respond to a single feature, or do they exhibit mixed sensitivity, mixed selectivity? Right? So those kinds of questions. And then, of course, lastly, how does the mapping relate to other models or theories of brain function that have been studied for decades? So we are in this data era where in the beginning, yes, people were sort of looking at from a neuroscience perspective, from a biological perspective, and so on. But now, yes, you can correlate those kinds of theories with what you observe in actual data. And third goal is, of course, biological plausibility. So simulating linear readout, and the assumption or the basic hypothesis here is that if the features can be extracted with a linear mapping model, then you can sort of say that you'll require fewer additional computations to use this in the downstream applications. Also incorporating measurement related considerations. So as we discussed about HRF, now most people assume that HRF is a fixed function, about 5 milliseconds of a delay and so on across voxels. However, this may or may not be true. So is there a nonlinear way of sort of modeling the HRF function, or a better way of modeling the HRF function? So these are all, these are some of the interesting computational cognitive science research goals. At this point, I'll probably pause for questions. If they are very quick questions, maybe I can take a few. Okay, online doesn't look like. Okay, so I think we can keep going. So let me start by talking about popular data sets. Now, there are several kinds of data sets across different modalities. So there are text-based data sets, visual data sets, audio data sets, video data sets, and there are, of course, other kinds of multimodal stimuli-based data sets as well. So text data sets, people have tried with words, sentences, paragraphs, different kinds of granularity, right? And the popular ones are Harry Potter stories, Zuko EG, and so on. We'll talk about them in detail in the next few minutes, maybe next 20 minutes or so. There are visual data sets. In fact, initial experiments with the data in cognitive computation, computational cognitive science, neuroscience, sort of started with visual data sets, binary visual patterns, and then slowly graduating to natural images, images of scenes, images of particular objects and object interactions, and so on. Audio data sets, various kinds of stories like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, narrative stories, as we'll see, and so on. Video data sets, different kinds of video data sets, and other kinds of multimodal data sets like words combined with images and so on. Yeah. Now, in all of these data sets that have been contributed and made available, many of them are publicly available for people to download and experiment with, right? So these are various perspectives or aspects across which these data sets differ, how they were collected, right? So some of them, most of them are actually fMRI data sets. However, some of them are EEG and MEG data sets as well. They have different sampling timings. So what is the TR, which is the sampling time, fixation point. So when a subject is actually looking at a stimuli, as the stimuli changes, or even while the stimuli is around, there might be a fixation. There is a fixation point typically, and the location, color, shape of the fixation point could differ. Form of stimulus representation. So it could be text, video, audio, images, particular task. So while the stimuli is being presented to the subject may be asked to do a particular task so as to activate, so as to make sure that there is good processing of the stimuli in the brain, right? So they may be asked to do question answering, property generation, understanding, and so on. We'll look at them one by one. Time given to participants, it could be anywhere from 1 minute to list the properties to even longer or shorter time periods. Oftentimes it's probably shorter so that the recording can be done more accurately. Right? Type of participants, different demographies, yeah. Number of times the response to stimuli was recorded, so as to have a more confidence in the recordings. And then lastly, of course, language. So what is the language which stimuli is presented when it is text-based? So let me talk about a few text stimuli data sets. Now, there are several of them, of course, as you see them here. And the way we have arranged them is to put up the data set, the type of the data set, language, stimulus, number of subjects, the paradigm. So essentially, what are the subjects told to do? Or rather, what were they mainly doing as an activity? The size of the data. Size of the data sort of tells you how big this data set is, how seriously you could use it, or how more confident you could be in terms of conclusions that you can derive from experiments on these data sets. And lastly, the task. What task were the subjects involved in when the data set was collected? Okay. So as you see, there are data sets coming up from 2014 and continuing further, right? There's several of them. In fact, more recent data sets are more multimodal in nature, and therefore you see more of them, until 2020. Okay. Most of them are fMRI, most of them are English, but then, hey, there are Italian and Japanese data sets as well, right? There are data sets about people reading passages or text from storybooks and movie reviews or Wikipedia, newspaper articles, all kinds of stimuli, words, words, and then paragraphs, sentences, and so on. Subjects is typically in a few tens, and then the paradigm, yes, they are reading stuff. So reading and viewing, that's the basic paradigm. Sizes differ. So sizes could be as small as that to sometimes pretty large kind of sizes. And people have been told to do various kinds of tasks like reading stories and so on. So in fact, imagining a situation that they personally can associate with a particular noun that was shown and so on. So several kinds of tasks as well. Now, in this presentation, the next few minutes, I'll sort of focus on these three data sets and talk a little bit more detail about them. So in this data set, the idea is that the participants were asked to sort of verbally enumerate in 1 minute the properties of whatever they can see on the screen. So they were shown, for example, they were shown like 3 different forms. So verbal or pictorial or verbal auditory. So they were shown, let's say, the word pineapple, and they were basically told to think, hey, it is a fruit, it's sweet, and so on and so forth. Right? And then they were shown again in the next 3 seconds another word, and so on. They were asked to think more about what to see, properties, and enumerate properties and talk about it. Yeah, and in the 7 seconds of time. Okay. There are different kinds of participants, so demographies vary. So there were sighted participants as well as blind participants, and they were shown verbal versus pictorial or verbal and auditory form of stimuli. So and they were shown words in Italian. So this is an Italian data set. So this one is concrete nouns. Yeah, this one is concrete noun, but the other one, this one is a Italian 70-word data set. So in this Anderson et al. Data set, these Italian words were shown. The words belong to 2 different categories, law and music, or rather two basic broad categories, law and music. And within that, they were sort of subdivided into 7 taxonomic categories, both in the law domain as well as in the music domain. So that sort of leads to 35 in law and 35 words in the music domain. There are also English translations of these words, but the participants were shown the Italian words. So well, these categories, as you see, there are all kinds of categories: abstract word category, attributes. So attributes of objects and so on, communication kind of words, prohibition, verdict, so various kinds of communication that can occur between people or groups, event, action kind of words, person, social role kind of words relating to individuals or some particular person and so on, location kind of words, object or tool kind of words, right? So essentially there are several kind of, words spread across multiple categories in the law and the music domain. The third data set, text-based data set, is this Zurich cognitive language processing corpus. And this is a pretty large corpus. In fact, the participants were asked to do 3 different tasks. Normal, reading reviews, reading Wikipedia sentences, or even in the third task, they were asked to read Wikipedia sentences, but the tasks were different. So for example, in this task, they were asked to read the sentences and rate the quality of the movie. So it's sort of rating, rating the reviews. Second task was to basically answer some control questions, like, if they read the sentence, then they were able to answer this particular multiple choice question. And the third task, the participants were asked to mark a specific relation that occurs in a given sentence. So Lincoln was the first Republican president, and does the sentence contain affiliation? Well, the answer is no. So that's that. So it does say political affiliation here. So yes, so the answer, basically the answer is yes, yeah. Right. So different kinds of tasks were given to people. The interesting part about this data set is, unlike other kind of data sets where you have limited time given to participants, here people could read the thing at their own personal reading speed, and then whenever the answer was provided by the subject, they were moved to the next question or the next stimulus. Now there are also, so we talked about text-based stimulus data sets. There are also visual stimulus data sets, and as you see, these basically date back to 2006. And there are more recent ones. This is a very recent one, and so on. So that's that. Most of them, as you see, are fMRI-based data sets. Initial stimulus-based data, initial visual data sets had binary patterns as stimuli and the typical kind of artificial patterns, not natural images. But later ones, as you see, are more of natural images in some ways. Again, as you see, subjects are about 10, around tens, a few tens maybe. Paradigm, yes, they're all viewing things, and sizes vary. So different sizes, different times, different number of times the same stimuli was shown to people, different number of experiments, and so on. Tasks, majorly it is passive viewing when people are looking at it, but then there are other interesting tasks like one-back repetition detection and so on, as we'll see in the next few slides. So in the next few slides, I'll sort of double click on a few of these data sets as have been highlighted here. So the first data set was by Therian et al. Way back in 2006. So this experiment was with artificial sort of patterns. For example, here these rotating wedges were shown. And expanding, contracting rings were also shown to the subjects. In yet another experiment, this domino experiment, rotating Gabor filters were shown both in the left and the right hemifield. Yeah. Then there were other kinds of experiments where 6 different kind of patterns were shown in each hemifield, and of course there's a fixation point as well, right at the center. In this experiment D, empty grids were shown both in the right and the left hemifield. With a plus as a fixation point, or left arrow or right arrow as a fixation point. And then they were asked to sort of imagine a particular pattern in the left and the right hemifield. The subjects were asked to imagine those patterns. This new data set essentially is about seen and imagined objects. So here there are two kinds of experiments. So fMRI data collected for 2 kinds of experiments. So presentation experiment and an imagery experiment. So in the presentation experiment, subjects were sort of presented the images as you see them here, and then they were asked to flag repetition. So if there's a repetition, the subject is supposed to press a button, and essentially they are given, for everything, they're given 9 seconds each. Yeah. In an imagery experiment, the subjects were shown a cue of this kind, cue stimuli, of which one of the words is sort of highlighted here. Then the subject was sort of, it is an imagery experiment, so the subject were instructed to imagine as many object images as possible related to the keyword that is highlighted. Well, after this experiment is done, they were also instructed to sort of rate the vividness of their mental imagery. So that's that. Yeah. so that's basically that. In these 15 seconds, sort of they imagine, and then they evaluate how vividly they could imagine, and then there is a rest, and then essentially, yes, the next one continues. Bold 5000 data set. Well, it's a reasonably large data set, around 20 hours of MRI scans for each of the 4 participants, and about 5,000 images. So these images come from 3 different sources: ImageNet images, COCO images, and scene images. ImageNet images are more. ImageNet is a very popular data set in the computer vision field, especially computer vision for deep learning these days, right? So these are more of a single object kind of images and not many interactions between objects that you see. On the other hand, COCO images are typically, many of them are multi-object images, and there are various kinds of interactions. So there are positional relationships being captured, action relationships also. Yeah. And scene images, well, they are scenes. So they could be indoor scenes, outdoor scenes, all various kinds of scene images that are there in the scenes image data set. And all of these 3 essentially come from popular data sets which are there in the computer vision field. And therefore, therefore, this data set is pretty nice of trying to correlate between the 2 fields nicely. Yeah. Algonauts data set, that's the Algonauts challenge data set. Here, the idea is that, yes, you see various images, and the aim is to, of course, learn a very good encoding model. The data set actually contains, of course, train and test parts, more like a hackathon. So the train part contains 2 kinds of images, 2 sets of images. Set 1 is about just Silhouette object images. So as you see them here. And set 2 is more of images with their natural backgrounds. Yeah, in the test part, they only have images in the natural backgrounds, but that's the data set. The data set. Now moving over to audio stimulus data sets. Well, there are several of them again, dating back from 2016 to very recent ones. Most of them are English, right? Only this one is Italian, and again, sizes sort of vary. The basic task here is, of course, listening, but then there are very interesting tasks that the subjects were supposed to be doing, like property generation task, or answering questions, or imagining themselves in a particular scenario that was told to them in an audio way. So those are the different kinds of tasks, and in the next few minutes, I'll sort of focus on the last 2 data sets. So this one is about imagining common scenarios. So the participants were sort of told that, hey, imagine a dancing scenario, and then so when they were talking about their dancing scenario, the fMRIs were recorded. So that's basic. So there were 20 different scenarios exist in the data set: resting, reading, writing, bathing, cooking, housework, and so on. And participants came up with various kinds of responses, right? So for the same dancing scenario, somebody could say, my daughter is a dancer and we are going to see her perform cultural center, and so on. So another participant could come with something else, and so on. Okay. Now participants were also asked to sort of rate their imagined scenarios on 20 different experiential attributes, right? So these are the attributes. So in their scenario, how much were these attributes linked or related, right? So that's what they were asked to rate. And participants came up with various kinds of ratings. So those ratings can actually be used as features just to sort of come up with better encoding and decode. Yeah. Narratives data set. So narratives data set basically contains several audio stories being heard by the subjects. These stories again vary in different sizes. In fact, total it's about 4.6 hours of data, and several subjects participated in this, and therefore the data set is pretty large. So the data set is very large. Yeah. So while the data set contains fMRIs connected with in this hearing task, there's also good alignment which is done with respect to the words. So words and the sound is sort of aligned nicely as part of the data set. Now there are various video kinds of data sets. So again, from 2019, very recent ones, so to 2021. In these video stimuli data sets, most of them again are fMRI, but there's an ECOG data set as well. Task is primarily passive viewing. People were just viewing this stuff. And again, people could be viewing episodes, people could be viewing ads, or people could be viewing other kinds of short video clips and so on. That's that. This data set was actually collected from patients. So the various kinds of patient, or other, yeah, I mean, these patients sort of participated rather than usual participants for this Pippi-Lankows data set. Okay. I'll talk in detail about Japanese ads data set and Algonauts data set again. So Japanese ads data set, this data set is about two kinds of ads: web ads and TV ads. And these ads basically, well, there are several movies, short ad movies across multiple categories as part of this data set. These the data set of course comes with fMRI, but also comes with other kinds of labels that are interesting. So scene descriptions, impression ratings. Remember, these are ads data set, so they can have various kinds of other metadata associated, ad effectiveness indices, and ad preference votes. So scene descriptions are more like human judges basically create scene descriptions with 50+ words per scene. So they are asked to just type out, hey, what do you see in this ad movie? Okay. Human rating on 30 different factors for every 2-second clip on a 0 to 4 scale. So what kind of, much like the experiential attributes thing. Yeah. Ad effectiveness. So what was the click rate? What was the view completion rate? The typical metrics that people measure in the computational advertising world. Ad preference votes. So each tester was sort of asked to recall TV ads that they have seen. And if they could recall one of those ads that are there as a part of data set, then you get a tally mark of 1. So you basically get a brownie point, or you add a point to the ad preference point to that particular ad if the tester could remember or recall that ad. Algonauts data set is short 3-second clips, video clips, as you see them here. And it's collected from 10 different human subjects watching about 1,000 such short video clips. Lastly, let me talk about other multimodal stimulus data sets besides just the video ones. Again, most of them are fMRI, but well, there is good variety here in terms of NIRS, functional NIRS data sets, English ones, and one Chinese one as well. And well, depending on the modes in the multimodal thing, the paradigms vary. So you could basically just have viewing word plus the picture, or viewing word, picture, or a word cloud, or viewing and listening if it also has audio with it. So that's that. And depending on, of course, the modes, people are also asked to do different kinds of tasks. They could be passive viewing or answering questions and so on, listening as well. Okay. So that's that. So I'll talk about a few of these in the next few minutes. So this particular data set has words with line drawings in it. So essentially subjects were, and the task that the people were told to do was, subjects were told to do was question answering while they are looking at these at these pictures. MEGs were recorded, so it's an MEG data set. Subjects were presented with a question, so is it man-made? And after that, they were basically shown pictures corresponding to 60 different concrete nouns. Now, for example, a bear or a carrot and so on, with some gaps in between, right? So with some time gaps in between. So the subjects were supposed to basically press a button to indicate yes. Basically, they indicated yes or a no for each of those images. Once all the 60 nouns are done, they are basically shown another question and so on, continues for 20 different questions. This is a popular Pareda data set from 2018. This has 3 different paradigms: word plus picture, sentences, word clouds. In fact, some of the experiments also show passages, as we will see. So they have 3 different experiments and data collected around those experiments. In the experiment 1, they basically show, of course, the word and then sentences or pictures and or the word cloud. And then there are fMRIs collected for each of them separately. There are about 180 such words. Some of them are concrete words, some of them are abstract words. And then there are other 2 experiments which are also done, where people are shown these text passages. For example, these are text passages coming from musical instruments broad topic, and there are 24 such broad topics in the data set. Experiment 3, there are 72 different passages that were shown, and each with, as you see, short passages, not too long, 3 or 4 sentences, and coming from around 24 different topics. Then there's the audio-visual stimuli data set. So the subjects were shown, and this is a FNIRS data set. Subjects were shown pictures along with audio for 3 seconds. 10 different objects, 50 different objects coming from 10 different categories that you see here. Visual presentation lasts for 3 seconds, as you see here, and there's a 10-second rest in some ways with a fixation point displayed. So that's about the data sets. Hopefully, sort of that motivates you. I mean, we are in a world where there's so much of awesome data, but that just basically makes us think about more. Can we have more such awesome data sets? Right. So that's that. Any questions about these data sets? Hope you sort of are excited enough to now work in this field if you're not working at all. Yeah. And thanks to so many awesome people all around, right? More and more awesome data sets are getting contributed. You will also see in the hands-on session today a very nice data set called neuromod from the neuromod group that we'll see in the hands-on sessions. Any questions that you may have? Offline or online? Online doesn't seem to be.
We have one question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Sorry, okay, just kidding.
Okay, just kidding. Okay.
Oh, we do have one question actually.
Oh, are there any data sets for non-normative people, basically patients? You
need to talk to the microphone or they won't hear you.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I could understand your question. Maria, probably you can take it, or maybe can repeat the question, Maria, if you don't mind.
Hi, are there any data sets for patients or non-normative cases?
Oh, yes, yes. So one of the data sets was actually collected from patients.
Okay.
There are also data sets from blind folks. So, but I agree. I sort of understand where you're coming from, and
Yeah.
to represent, yeah.
Okay. I apologize, I missed that. So which one was the patient data set?
Oh, there was one of those. So let me just go back. I think this is the one. So Pipilanco's data set. So this was basically collected from patients.
Pipilanco's, okay.
So yes, in fact, there are also links. So those slides are hidden here, but as you will see, there are also references to them. So please look at those slides, right? You'll get references from there.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes. Somebody's asking, is there a single link where you can find all these data sets? Well, we are trying to do that. So on our GitHub link, you will find links to them. But as I mentioned in the previous question as well, there are links to the papers in the hidden slides, not here. Please have a look at that. Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering if for the studies that did imagery, they evaluate kind of the imagery effectiveness or the ability of the people who did it. I know I can find that out in the studies, but I'm wondering if you go.
Yeah, I see. I may not remember it very accurately, but I think they just assumed that the people who are imagining are essentially, doing their job really well. So basically, the data set was really used for assuming that everything is fine. Can we do brain encoding, decoding appropriately? I think they were also asked to. In one of those things, at least, they were also asked to essentially judge their vividness. So how nicely they could imagine things. So, and was that incorporated as part of encoding or decoding accuracy and so on? We'll have to go back and check the paper. Yes. Okay, hope that answers. Great questions. If that is that, then I think we can keep going and move to the second part, which is essentially about stimulus representations. So in this particular part, this is a 1 hour, 30 minutes. I'm a little over. I'm already 15 minutes over. I get that, but I think we'll make up for it in this part. Yeah. So I'll talk about text stimulus representations, visual stimulus representations, audio, multimodal, and then we'll also have a hands-on part. Yeah. So if you want to be a little early into hands-on, please go ahead and look up at tinyurl.com/dl4brain. But otherwise, we will have enough setup time, so you need not hurry. That's that. Okay. So let's basically get started with these stimulus representations. Let me sort of introduce how people represent various kinds of stimuli. For text stimuli, people have basic NLP representations in terms of typical statistical representations, corpus counts, corpus co-occurrence counts, or more enhanced representations like topic models, linguistic properties like part of speech tagging, dependency parsing, or semantic role labeling, and so on. Yeah. There are also discourse-based features. So especially in the video data sets, discourses matter, and therefore there are those kinds of features as well. Semantic features in terms of deep learning kind of thing, like word embedding methods, sentence representation models, recurrent neural networks, transform methods for encoding in a deep learning sense. And exponential attributes as well, so which are more like features, but then domain engineered features, very nice features. Yeah. Visual stimuli. So these, for these, basically there are older kind of image processing features like visual field filter banks, Gabor wavelet pyramids, and so on, and then more newer kinds as well, which involve deep learning based models like the HMAX model or the convolution neural network models. Audio stimuli, again, there are basic feature engineering kind of things like phoneme rate and the presence of phonemes. And then there are also some sort of deep learning kind of methods, one of them like SoundNet that I'll talk about. And then there are representations for multimodal stimuli as well, using multimodal transformers that we'll talk about, recent work from our group. Okay. Let's start with text stimulus representations. As I mentioned earlier, well, there are these 4 different kinds of representations: basic NLP representations, corpus counts, topic models, and so on, discourse representations, deep learning based representations, and experiential attributes. The experiential attributes could be ratings on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 to 6, or they could also be binary ratings. Okay. So let's start with the first one. So corpus co-occurrence counts. Now, these are data sets where words are the stimuli being presented to the subjects, and then people try to figure out co-occurrence counts of these words with the other popular anchor words in some ways. These anchor words could be these popular verbs. So there are these 25 popular verbs which were used. So these verbs sort of correspond to basic sensory and motor activities, or actions which can be done on objects, or actions which involve spatial relationships. So words that can sort of correlate with the way we think. And that is why these folks sort of use this vocabulary of words, 25 verbs. Right? For each verb and a stimulus word, you would go back to a large corpus and sort of count how many times they co-occur. That's that. Yeah. Again, they did some basic pre-processing to ensure that, hey, tasted all basically mean the same, and so on. So basic kind of a stemming in some ways, yeah, so as to incorporate conflated counts across variants and so on. So that's that. So 985 common English words were also used in another work, right? Some similar kind of study, corpus co-occurrence counts. Topic models. So people have also used topic models like LDA. Topic modeling using LDA. So the way you do this is, given the words, get relevant wiki pages associated with those words. For example, for airplane, basically get this particular Wikipedia title page, and then also try to figure out other linked Wikipedia pages like aircraft cabin, right? So that sort of gave them essentially 3,500 pages. Now, out of those 3,500 pages, you could run LDA. LDA is a technique for doing topic modeling. It's more like clustering on text in some ways, right? So that, and then you can specify the number of, or rather you have to specify the number of topics or clusters. So they sort of varied the clusters from 10 to 100, and they found out topics. So topics basically means, topic distribution. So essentially across, let's say 100 topics, in some ways for every word, they have like a distribution over 100 topics, a probability distribution, which tells how much the word belongs to each of those topics. Yeah. So that's that. And these could be used as features. So the idea is to use these as features for brain encoding and decoding purposes. Yeah. So that's the topic modeling part. Then people have used other kinds of basic NLP representations like word length, how many characters and so on. Is the word one of the 28 unique part of speech tags, or 17 unique part of the 17 unique dependency relationships. Right? So these dependencies are basically dependencies coming from Core NLP parser from Stanford. So it's the most popular dependency parser. So that's what they use, and essentially 17 unique dependency relationships is the word belong to them. Yeah. Position of the word in the sentence, that's also another feature. And then the last kind of features that were sort of a part of this basic NLP representations are role-based features. So is the word the main verb of the sentence, or is it an agent or a patient in the sense experiencer or the experiencer or the recipient? Is it a word a part of predicate, or it's a modifier or complement, and so on. So that's the role played by the word in the sentence. Now, those were some basic NLP representations for text stimuli. Now, continuing further for text stimuli, right, there are other kinds of representations like discourse features. So again, this holds for stories kinds of data sets. So in Harry Potter, a particular chapter, let's say there are 10 characters. So you resolve all the pronouns also to the characters, and then make binary features to signal in this particular sentence is one of those characters mentioned, right? So these are all binary features, more or less. Yeah. Motion-based features. So they essentially identified this set of popular motions. So fly, manipulate, and you can imagine Harry Potter, so collide physically and so on, all kinds of motions. Yeah. And then they essentially have again binary features mentioning is this particular motion mentioned in the sentence, in the stimuli that is shown. Speech-based features, again, so there are different kinds of features, and there's a vocabulary that they associate with each of them and try to check for presence or absence of that kind of feature, that kind of motion or a speech or emotion or verb and so on. Okay. So that's that. Now there are, of course, deep learning based representations also, starting with the basic deep learning based representations like the word stimuli, like the embeddings for word stimuli. Okay. So the idea is that when you have a stimuli, you will have for encoding specifically, you would basically you can basically capture an embedding for each of those words, a word embedding, a vector, right? Which is subject independent. Now this vector carries a generic meaning of the particular word. And then, of course, you could have a subject dependent part. So which could basically take this embedding and then map it to the brain response. Yeah. Different kinds of embeddings have been tried in the literature. People have used GLOVE 300-dimensional embeddings to word-to-vec embeddings, non-negative sparse embeddings as well. Skipgram-based word embeddings using GenSim. And again, also trained on other kinds of corpora than the standard word-to-vec, yeah, which has been trained on Google News corpus primarily. Yeah. Fast text embeddings. So people have used different kinds of embeddings. And in fact, some of those pieces of work in the literature have also tried to compare across these different methods. Across different embedding methods. In fact, people also try to compare them across different types of words, so nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And they sort of found that yes, different kinds of embeddings could be really useful for capturing noun accuracy across nouns, verbs, or adjectives. Yeah. So mostly everything works well for nouns, but across verbs and adjectives, yes, one has to be choosy about which embedding works better. There are other kinds of methods beyond embeddings, deep learning based methods like LSTMs, so long short-term memory networks, which are a form of RNNs. Now, this particular paper sort of talked about LSTMs. People have, of course, used the vanilla LSTMs, just trying to predict the next word in a Elmo kind of a setup. Or people have also tried in a multitask setup where people are trying to predict not just the next word, but not just the next word using a typical language modeling loss, but also predicting the part of speech tag of the next word. Yeah. And as I was saying, yes, people have used it in the Elmo kind of a way. Elmo is a model which is basically an LSTM-based model. It's a forward LSTM and a backward LSTM combined together, but not a bidirectional LSTM. So two separate models. And you sort of take representations across layers. It's a multi-layer LSTM model. You take representations across layers and use them as features. So this is also one of those times where people started looking at longer context rather than looking at just embeddings, which look at just that word. If you have a full sentence, then can I sort of try to understand the meaning of this word based on the previous few words as well? So longer context, right? And at least in this work, people observed that yes, if you look at two different layers of Elmo, if you look at two different layers of Elmo, the higher accuracy is actually obtained using layer 1. And well, longer the context, the accuracy sort of improves, at least until size 20. Yeah, until size 20. Further, people basically said that, hey, if I have to have sentence embeddings, maybe what I could do is to look at each of those words independently in the sentence and just pull those embeddings in an unstructured manner. So unstructured basically means that I don't care about the sequence, in a bag of words manner, right? So people tried simple pooling methods like average pooling, max pooling, which are the most popular pooling methods in deep learning, right? And people have also done concatenation of these two pooling methods. So you take the word embeddings, take the average of all the words, word embeddings of all the words in the sentence, and that basically gives you the representation for the sentence. On the other hand, people have also done a more systematic way of doing pooling, and two of them are fast-sent pooling and SIF pooling. Now, fast-sent pooling learns sentence embeddings by considering the embedding for a sentence, the initial embedding for a sentence, as some of the word embeddings, some of the embeddings of all the words contained in the sentence. Now you might be thinking, well, this is almost the same as the average pooling method, but it's not. It's a little different because average pooling method does not involve learning embeddings, while the fastest method sort of involves learning embeddings while you are trying to optimize them for sentences. Yeah. So in the average pooling method, you assume that the word embeddings are already learned and you have them and you just pool them to get the embedding for a sentence. But in the fastest method, you are actually learning sentence embedding, based on the word embeddings, and those words embeddings are also being learned as you learn these sentence embeddings. Yeah. In the SF method, well, it's also a pooling method. However, the weights are not uniform. So essentially, you have a weighted averaging over the words which are contained in the sentence. Now, besides this, people have also come up with other kinds of LSTM-based models, structured models, which sort of incorporate recurrence and therefore can incorporate sequence aspect in the sentences. So there are the various popular such methods: skip thought, quick thought method, InfoSent, Jensen, USC, the universal sentence encoder method, and so on. So now again, we don't have enough time to go into details of those methods, but if you're really interested, you can sort of look at them at various literature. So these are popular methods in NLP as well. So several tutorials on how these methods work in general. So there is good comparison across these methods, and people, at least at this time point, sort of observed that InfoSent worked really well. So the InfoSent method at this time point in 2018 or so, people sort of believe that InfoSent gives you really good results compared to just looking at words individually. Yeah. People also tried, of course, transform-based methods. So in fact, here, the universal sentence encoder is also a transform-based method, but people tried other transform-based methods also, like BERT and then transformer XL. And as you see, people have tried to vary the context length. So how much context length matters? Of course, and compute the prediction accuracy. People have also tried to see, hey, if I look at a transformer is a multi-layer model, right? So which layers are more meaningful for prediction? And more or less, folks have figured out that in general, the layers in the middle. So typically, for example, in this 20-layer transformer that you see, people have observed that somewhere in the middle, right, 11 to 13 layers give you the best prediction accuracy with very large context being used. So large context being used. Okay. In fact, people then showed, of course, until here, also people sort of observe that across different types of experiments, InfoSent still gives you comparable accuracy to these transformer-based methods. However, over time, people have shown that yes, transformer-based methods do give you better accuracies in terms of encoding and decoding. So these are essentially, so yes, so this is another work from 2019, again, where what the authors tried to do was to take the original transformers, the BERT model, but not really take the original BERT model as it is. They essentially fine-tuned it for various NLP tasks. So there's paraphrase classification, question answering, various kinds of tasks, right? You fine-tune it for those tasks. You also take the language model, the original transform-based language model, and try to train it in these two different ways. So language model scrambled and language model scrambled para. So in the language model scramble, what they've done is to take the words and shuffle the words across the sentences and use them for learning the language model. In the language model scrambled para, what they've done is to shuffle the words such that the words could be anywhere in the paragraph. So shuffling across a paragraph versus shuffling across a sentence. Yeah. And a very, very surprising discovery that they have. And then there is a language modeling part of speech tag also, where the language modeling loss is not for predicting the next word, but for predicting the part of speech tag, but only predicting the part of speech tag of a masked word. Yeah. So what they, very surprisingly, what they observed is that the scrambled LMs work best, right? So it's surprising because people sort of believe that yes, sequence aspect should basically result into better accuracies, but what they observed was that yes, the scrambled language models work best. However, over time, this is our recent paper at NACL 2022, and also other pieces of work sort of showed that yes, the original models themselves, transform models themselves, but fine-tuned across different tasks, could lead to reasonably good accuracies. In fact, we fine-tuned them for several of these tasks. These tasks are a part of a NLP benchmark called as GLUE. And then we compared the accuracies that you could obtain on this Pereira et al. 2018 data set across different tasks. We did observe, in fact, that the accuracies corresponding to similar tasks are similar in nature. The kind of representations that are learned are also pretty similar. So the dendrogram sort of shows how similar these representations are across different tasks. So that's basically about majorly about text-based deep learning representations for text stimuli. However, there are other kinds of setups as well. For example, there's an interesting multitask setup where you have the sentence being provided as input to a transformer, but then you also have fMRI being decoded, or other, sorry, fMRI being predicted, fMRI response, and also the MEG response being predicted. So both of them. Right? And then there are, of course, several kinds of settings that have been tried. So settings which involve fine-tuning PERT or not, and then fine-tuning from a particular subject perspective versus fine-tuning separately for individual subjects, using MEG or not, and so on. So here multitask setup is more from a multi kind of a measurement kind of a perspective. So it's fMRI versus MEG measurements. Okay. So that's that. Now, again, there are very interesting results in this paper talking about, yes, fine-tuned models predict fMRI data better than vanilla BERT. So fine-tuning helps. Also, so fine-tuning on the particular data set, right? Of course, by now non-fine-tuned BERT, I mean, the vanilla BERT, you basically just give the sentence, you use the representation, and then just try to predict the fMRI. No, better than that, you actually fine-tune it on some sentences and fMRI training data, and then test it on other fMRI pieces. Yeah, other instances. Relationships between text and brain activity generalize across experiment participants. So you could train models on some participants and apply them to others. That's nice. Using MEG data can actually improve, so this multi-test setup actually helps. Yeah? And then a single model can be used to predict fMRI activity across multiple experiment participants. So that's the nice part. Multiple interesting conclusions here. Now there are also some pieces of work which try to sort of look at representations by disentangling the semantic and the syntactic part of those representations, and then trying to correlate them with interesting ways of thinking about representations. So, for example, you could take this phrase, not very happy, and you could look at them as three different words, not, very, and happy, which is basically its lexical meaning. So what does not mean, what does very mean, and so on. Or you could also look at them from from a perspective of sort of trying to understand part of speech. So some syntax, right? So for example, adverb, and adjective. Right? You could also think of them from a compositional perspective. You can build a syntactic tree over it, and very happy would be an adverbial phrase in some ways, and not very happy, so some sort of a phrase, right? Or you could basically also come up with a compositional meaning, some semantics extracted from it, which basically says, oh, not very happy means negative sentiment. Yeah. So people have tried to sort of then disentangle these representations and try to understand that, hey, if I was just using syntactic representations versus semantic representations, what kind of accuracies will I get in terms of encoding and decoding? Yeah. Of course, this also leads to other kinds of interesting questions that, yes, the syntax part, understanding the syntax part of the language activates which brain areas versus the semantic part activates which kind of brain areas. And then people have done it, of course, using different kinds of transformer models, XLNet, Roberta, BERT, Distil, GPD, and so on. Yeah. Lastly, I'll talk about these exponential attributes, and then I'll pause for questions. So exponential attributes model is more like a feature engineering model, but features are essentially engineered in a very, very domain-specific manner. By domain, I mean, words which can matter in terms of thinking, in terms of human brain thinking. So in this bunch of papers from Anderson et al., right, they have used these kinds of words, and they asked people to actually scale their experience in terms of these particular words. Stimuli, how does it relate with these words? And so for example, the question that was asked was, on a scale of 0 to 6, to what degree do you think of a banana as having a characteristic or defining color? Why banana? Well, of course, banana was shown as a stimuli to the person whose fMRI was recorded, and so on. Okay. Now, you would think that, yes, you could use just text-based models. You could basically take the word embedding for banana, and it should be sufficient. Big deal about asking people to tell about color of banana, or whatever, right? I mean, essentially different kinds of questions that can lead to banana, right? So, but then the interesting part is in the way the embeddings are learned, they do not capture common sense, some of them, unfortunately, because common sense is not something that is spoken or written, right? So it is rarely useful to communicate the color of bananas because it's sort of so obvious to all those who are experiencing, right? So therefore, oftentimes word embeddings don't capture those, and that is the value add that such exponential attributes have on top of the word embeddings that you're using anyway. Now, different people use different set of attributes, but yes, the goal is more or less to use some sort of attribute representation as exponential attributes. Now, some folks have actually also used binary attributes just to ask that, hey, is this word related to any of these categories, or take these neurally plausible semantic features and try to check if the stimuli relates to any of those features. So that's that. I think to summarize, we talked in this part about text stimulus representations, and we talked about basic NLP representations to discourse-based features to deep learning-based features to finally experiential attributes. Yeah. I'll pause for questions. Let's quickly see. Yeah, so slides are out there. Thanks. Yeah, this is great. Any questions? Any questions? Yeah. Any questions? If there are no questions, we keep going. So let me quickly go over visual stimulus representations as well. And yeah, there are various kinds of representations from visual field filter banks, Gabor wavelet pyramids, HMX model, and CNN model. Again, I'll sort of rush through the first few because they're pretty old and not many people use them now. Older image processing literature used to use these popularly, but frequently, but now people have moved on to CNNs, convolutional neural networks, and so on. So these are Gabor wavelets. These are sort of filters, which these days people learn using CNNs, but in the olden days, yes, people would have designed these filters with different kinds of orientations, as you see, well, different kinds of orientations that you see here, and different kinds of rates that you see here, different kinds of rates that you see here, spatial frequency as well as orientations and phases, different filters, and they would convolve such filters to the original image so as to get different kinds of features out of the image. And then, yes, there is various kinds of processing that is done. Some of this processing also involves these weights, so as to extract the energy signal out of these wavelets. And that basically is used to predict the response. So these particular features, are essentially learned using gradient descent. So that's essentially the method that they have. Now, HMAX model is the is a very initial model in terms of deep learning. They essentially have multiple layers, as you see here, which now in today's world correspond to some sort of convolutional and pooling layers. So there are different kinds of layers trying to extract various kinds of features from the visual stimuli. CNNs, so various kinds of CNN models are very popular these days, starting from typical LXNet or VGGNet, and then graduating over to Inception, ResNet, DenseNet, and so on, which have become popular over time, deeper and deeper convolutional neural networks. People have also used other kinds of features extracted from images. For example, you can take an image. So this is work on videos. So you could split a video. A video is, after all, a sequence of images. So you could split a video across frames. And for each frame, you could sort of extract concepts or objects in the frame. And then for each object, you have a word embedding. So you could create an embedding matrix given a video. And then also apply a PC on it so as to get some interesting features out of this video. So this is basically a nice video representation. For every frame, when you extract embeddings for every word, you could basically come up with a frame embedding as an average of the words or the concepts extracted from that frame. Other kinds of methods sort of focus on coming up with indirect representations. So indirect representations basically mean when you have small amount of label data, can you still come up with representations which can lead to improved encoding decoding accuracy? So Maria and Subha will of course talk about them in more detail. But here I'll basically just say that yes, autoencoders are popular mechanisms in deep learning these days, so as to come up with really awesome representations for various kinds of input, even in an unsupervised setup. So especially if you have very small amount of supervised data, then you can learn very good representations in an unsupervised setup using autoencoders and fine-tune them, polish them nicely using small amount of labeled data, leading to really awesome semi-supervised representations, as you see here. Yeah. So yes, this kind of semi-supervised representations help in better decoding. So as you see, this is the ground truth images that were shown to the people. And if you did not use this autoencoder kind of a technique, then you would only be able to reconstruct to this quality. But yes, the quality surely improves if you're trying to reconstruct by using this semi-supervised technique, semi-supervised autoencoder based CNNs. This is an old work from a group. Where the idea is to use convolutional LSTMs, autoencoder, in fact, so as to essentially reconstruct fMRIs. And this is probably very few works essentially try to reconstruct fMRIs by thinking about them as a sequence of slices. So a sequence of slices, and which is what we exploited in this work. So we essentially start with the slice 0 and then try to predict the activations in the next slice based on the previous slice and so on. Of course, while having the stimuli-based features as input. Okay. That's about visual stimulus. Any questions? Otherwise, sort of, I will quickly move to audio stimulus, multimodal stimulus, and then it's time for our setup for hands-on. Any quick questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, let's keep going. So audio stimulus representations, there are not too many representations. People have tried to use basic audio features like word rate or the phoneme rate, presence of phonemes. Some of them have also used other kinds of features like yes, frequency, amplitude, wavelength, or zero crossings and so on. So which are popular audio-based features. Now, recently, deep learning for speech has become quite popular as well. And people have used other kinds of architectures like CNNs, which run on spectrograms. So spectrogram are these interesting image kind of representations from audio. You take an audio, and for every frequency, you sort of note down the power at that frequency. So in the sense, the magnitude in some ways about that frequency in that audio segment. And that nicely captures the audio segment in a nice image on which you can run CNNs. And that's one way of sort of encoding an audio. Other way is the SoundNet method. So the SoundNet method actually is a very interesting method. It sort of takes your unlabeled video, gets the raw waveform out of it, computes spectrogram out of it, and what you see here is a nice convolution neural network which sort of tries to encode this video. On the other hand, you can also take the RGB frames from this video, and for each of those frames, you could basically run an object detector or a scene detector on top of it. So again, off-the-shelf object detectors are available. For example, RCNN. So FRCNN is pretty popular, the faster RCNN version. But well, these days there are other kinds of interesting object detection mechanisms like YOLOs, which can detect detect objects at very high speed from videos. I mean, often used for driverless cars as well. But anyway, so those particular networks are also used here. So as to figure out the object distribution and the scene distribution. And the idea is that as you're learning this sound representation, you should make sure that the sound representation correlates with the RGB frames, the visual information that was there in the video very nicely. So the semantic representation of the audio should be as close to the scene distribution or the object distribution on the visual aspect of the video. So that is how you train this network, and then essentially, when you just have audio, you just basically pass it through this kind of a CNN method and get the representation from the output. That's about audio stimuli. Lastly, talking about multimodal stimulus representations. Well, there are representations for videos, and when you try to do representation for videos, you could pass images through VGG, visual information through VGG, and the audio information through SoundNet. So there are people who experimented with those kinds of methods. And there is also work where multimodal could mean image plus text, where you could have an image representation in terms of VGG network and text representation in terms of GLOVE or ELMO. Now, for image stimuli representation, typically VGG is one of the most popular CNNs because it strikes a nice balance between the size and accuracy. It comes in two sizes, typically VGG 16 and 19. Compared to other kinds of models which are pretty large in size. So if you have enough compute power, of course, you use deeper image-based models. Otherwise, you live with these smaller ones. So that's that. Now, yes, I mean, you could have these representations, and you could also average or concatenate some of these. So you could possibly have a GLOVE and an ELMO representation, and you could concatenate them and use them as a concatenated text representation. Of course, you could have a VGG representation, other representations for images. And finally, to come up with a multimodal representation, you could take the text and the visual representation and concatenate them as well. So that's that. However, if you want to sort of make use of recent advancements in multimodal deep learning, you could do a whole bunch of representations for multimodal stimuli. So in this recent work, we have tried various mechanisms for modeling multimodal stimuli. Starting from the simple concatenation kind of method, which is often also called as the late fusion method. So you could basically take any of these popular image-based models, VGGNet 19 as you see here, or ResNet, or Inception V2 ResNet, EfficientNet, and so on. And you could also take any of your text representations. Here we took Roberta, but you could take BERT, you could take so many. So So what I've not yet seen in the neuroscience world is representations for multilingual kind of a data. Yeah, so that's one data set that I would love to see in the near future, especially a data set which is multilingual, multimodal in nature. That would be really nice to have. Yeah, and then people learning representations over them and trying to see what the brain can, how much of the brain responses can be reconstructed. So, but then in this work, yes, we took those image and text representations and used just image-based transformers or multimodal representations. Multimodal representations, we used 2 of them, late fusion models or early fusion models, which are basically multimodal transformers. So late fusion models are basically concatenation at the end. So you could take a VG19 image representation and robot text representation, concatenate the end, connect to the dense layer, which tries to predict brain response variables. Yeah. Or you could basically do early fusion. So several kinds of early fusion multimodal models are popular in the literature today, right? So including Visual BERT, WilBERT, LXMERT, CLIP, and so on. So we experimented with some of them, and actually we observed that using Visual BERT, which is a multimodal early fusion model, essentially performs the best for brain encoding. So that's basically our recent work on learning multimodal stimuli representations. Okay. So that takes me to the hands-on part. Any questions before we get there, though? So I'm probably about 5 minutes off, but that's okay. Yeah. Any questions at this point? Quickly take 1 or 2. Okay, so if there are no, so usually in my class, I basically tell people to motivate them to ask questions. It's a good motivation, right? So one of my professors used to say that, hey, if you attend a session and you don't ask a question, then you are most likely just, not attending the session. You might be physically there, but not mentally. So therefore, I always tend to ask at least one question. So hopefully that motivates, and you may use that to, ask more questions. Okay, so any questions from the room? Okay, so if there are no questions, I think Maria and Subba, maybe we can get to the next part, which is about doing the setup. Just if you're around and you would like to take over the screen.
Yeah, Joshna, are you?
Yeah, I can stop
Can
sharing.
you share?
Yeah, Joshna, if you can share, yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, Joshna, go ahead.
So, is my screen visible?
Yep, we can see your screen, Joshna.
So this is the GitHub repo that we'll be using. This has all the links for the collab notebooks that we would be using. We would go first with the feature extraction, and it has the collab links available. We don't particularly have a setup session for it. Unmute. So maybe Manish sir, you can start with that with the collab work.
Got it, Joshna. Thanks so much. So folks, as you can see, the link is pretty easy. So you can actually.
I'll copy the link in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah. So link is actually there as well. Yeah, please copy, Joshna. Yeah. So folks, you could essentially start by downloading this repo, clone it, and essentially, we will go over the code in different sessions. So essentially, I will start by going over the first part, which is about feature extraction. We will do things on Colab so that it is so that the environment is sort of shared across different people and so on. You could do it the way you prefer. You could essentially do it in the hands-on way, or you could also do it in a demo kind of way. So basically, if you think that you would like to focus more on what is going on here, that's fine as well. But if you think that you would like to actually experiment as we speak, then Maria and Subha are there. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there, so I mean, yeah, so I couldn't be there in person, but Maria and Subha are there to help as well. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Jashna. If I can take over the screen, yes.
Just a quick announcement for the
Please go
people in the room who might not have Wi-Fi. So the password, so the Wi-Fi is Coxsci, and the password is small letters PW 2020 Coxsci. Sorry, 22. Yeah.
So there's no, like in particular, there's no need to like clone the repo. You can directly like use the links from here.
Absolutely, yes.
We have a question in the room. Just a second. Yeah, so it's tinyurl.com/DL4brain. I can also.
Yep. So that's the URL. Okay. So if folks are sort of they have logged into their Colab and clicked on the first one and second one, maybe you can sort of get started. Okay. I think we have about 35 minutes or so from now until the coffee break. And we will try to do various kinds of things that we can. Otherwise, yes, you have the material. You can do it at your convenience as well. Yeah. Maria, all okay to start the room? All good?
Maybe just a second. I will project all the important things here just to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Please do. Yes.
Yep.
I will probably then stop sharing.
Again, thanks for your patience. So this is the Wi-Fi, and this is the link to the code and materials. Yeah.
Yes, Thomas. The links. It's basically just links for the Google Drive. That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So, sorry, Manish. We have a question in the room.
That's fine.
How can I access the stream? Like, step up later?
So the stream will be available after 24 hours, I believe. Yeah.
So how are people attending virtually right now? Just using online?
Oh yeah, if you want to join live, I think via Dunderline. Yeah. Yeah, there's a Zoom link there. Yeah. And then all the recordings will be available 24 hours later. Okay. Is everybody good in the room? Okay, great. Thanks. Manish, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. This is great. So I have started sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen. Please let me know. Yeah, okay. So yes, I know. I mean, online folks surely can see my screen, but I'm hoping that the room can also see the screen. Yeah, Maria, confirm?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, this is great. So this particular thing has 3 Jupyter notebooks. This particular part has 3 Jupyter notebooks. One of them is for learning the word representations. The other is for ImageNet. And the third one is for a BERT kind of a representation. So these word representations are more like word embeddings. So we'll look at 3 different word embedding methods. Right? ImageNet is for image representations. So we'll look at some image stimuli representation methods. And then, the BERT representations are representations using representations of sentences or words or paragraphs using the BERT transformer model. Okay. So here, these are the word representations. Let's sort of start. I will actually just run all so as to while we go over everything. So we are going to start with the glove representation, which is very popular. Glove is essentially a word embedding method. So for every word, you have a vector, numeric vector representing that word. And fortunately, that those representations of various words are publicly available on Stanford's website. So the first step that we are actually doing here is basically just importing a few packages, downloading this glove zip file. Now this download on Colab should not take too long. It probably takes about 2 minutes or so. So as it shows here, the ETA is about 2 minutes. But once the download is done, we're going to unzip the file. The zip actually contains a whole bunch of representations, 3 or 4 glove representations, which are of different sizes. So one of them is like 50 dimensional, the other is 100 dimensional, 200 dimensional, and so on. So after this unzips, we are sort of going to use the 50 dimensional representation. Okay, everything should sort of work seamlessly for you as well. In general, you could also do like run all, and then yes, clearly the best way to understand code is to run it and then also try to debug it in base, try to print various kinds of things as we speak, right? So as to understand it better. Yeah. So here, the glove representation file is in general, in fact, we are going to use a 50 dimensional file. And this file is a text file. So essentially, this is a very, very simple format. Every line essentially just contains the word and its 50 dimensional representation. That's all, right? So that's what we are reading here. So we are reading a file line by line, splitting it, and splitting with a tab and so on, getting the word and its representation. Very simple. So we can also print the length of the dictionary. It basically tells us how many words are there in this particular in this embedding file. Right? As we will see, so it will print the vocabulary, but again, because we are a little short on time, maybe we'll sort of go over. Probably we can wait for some time, let it sort of download quickly, and you can look at the vocabulary size. We can also look at a particular representation for some word. These representations, so as I said, you don't need to really do anything if you want to make use of these representations. All you need to do is to basically just download the file, get the right file, read it using just simple Python code, and then start using them as features. So given a new stimuli, you're essentially going to figure out the word in this dictionary, get the right word, and then use it in your task, in your encoding task, in your decoding task, and so on. Yeah. So that's that. Okay. So once you have the glove dictionary, what I have also done here is to sort of just show a few of those representations and how they are semantically connected with each other, right? Or rather, do they really capture semantics at all? In fact, when people basically propose these various distributional embeddings, as they are called, word2vec or glove or fasttext and so on, the main aim of proposing them was to be able to come up with a representation that can semantically capture the meaning of these words. The idea is that if it can capture the semantics and understanding like a human does, then it should be able to solve analogy tasks like king is to men, king is to men, then what is to women, right? So things of that kind. Or India is to New Delhi, then Sri Lanka is to what? So sort of capital kind of a task, mapping capitals kind of task to countries and so on. So so as to understand that, yes, if it is able to do those kinds of things, we are essentially going to look at a few embeddings and see their similarities. For example, king and queen should probably be more closer to each other compared to, let's say, king and water, right? If they are reasonably good representations. So what has happened so far is that, yes, we have downloaded the representations, we have unzipped the file, we have loaded the representations. We see that there are about 400,000 different words in this dictionary, okay, of which we are really interested in a few words just to sort of look at a toy case. Yeah. And we actually also print the representation for king. It's just a Python dictionary, so very easy to actually print the representation. As you see, these representations could be any numbers, not necessarily positive, could be any negative, positive numbers, but more or less close to zero. Now, very few numbers are actually far away, larger ones, right? But most numbers are smaller, close to zero. Yeah, so that's that. And again, we can actually print the sizes just to confirm that, yes, it is 50-dimensional embeddings. So I'm just printing here that, hey, I have actually taken those 11 words, figure out those 11 words, and actually created a small dictionary of 50-dimensional for each of them so that I can experiment with them, visualize them, and so on. Now, this piece of the code is just computing cosine similarities, just to sort of understand that, yes, these representations make sense. For example, cosine similarity between king and queen is 0.78, and that makes sense compared to, let's say, king and water, which is 0.23. Now, again, river and water has a very high cosine similarity, 0.62, right? And river and ocean have a high cosine similarity and so on. So they do carry semantic sense, right? So river, water, ocean are related, tree, leaf are related, and so on. In fact, the later part of the notebook actually take these 50-dimensional embeddings and reduces the dimensionality to just 2 using PCA, so that we can actually visualize those representations. So you can actually visualize and then say that, yes, glad and happy are similar because they are close together in this representation space. Similarly, king and queen are similar, mother and daughter are similar, leaf, tree are similar, water, ocean, river are similar, right? So those are groups. So this representation, again, this visualization is not the exact visualization because the exact thing is 100-dimensional or 50-dimensional, but we are reducing the dimensionality to just 2 so as to essentially visualize them nicely. Yeah. So that's about the glove part. I mean, getting glove representation is super easy, as we saw, and you could, of course, use these in your neuroscience world for other kinds of things. Yeah. Do you have the same model which produce binary features for word in similar way to glove or word to vec? Well, if you want to produce the binary features, those are experiential features, right? So those are more like human generated labels. So for example, what is the color for banana? Is it yellow or not? Now, yes or no kind of things. Those are human generated features and they can't be really generated using automated mechanisms. So that's that. Okay. While these are automatically generated in some ways using neural networks, so these are embedding based features. The two are different. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, was there a question I couldn't hear?
I'll take a look and get back to you. That's for the which one? That's for editing. That's for the edit.
Sorry, sorry, Maria, if the question is in the room, maybe you could take it up because sometimes it is sort of difficult.
Can I, this is for the dresser? But the.
Go ahead.
For the dresser will be in oak, right?
I'm still not able to understand what you're trying to ask. I'm sorry for that. So if you are online, can you please type the question if that sounds okay?
Oh, the editing area.
I think, excuse me, if you're not speaking or asking a question, could you please mute yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. So it seems like this is a different thing. If you're not speaking or asking a question, please mute yourselves. Yes, yeah.
I hope you get the dresser.
Yeah. Ham, should I be muting you? Not sure though.
Oh. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, folks. I think we are good. Sorry for that. Yep. Yeah. Then Thomas has another question. And that is thinking about binary embeddings, says binary features, embeddings. Oh, okay. Interesting. So these are not binary in nature. These are numbers, as we saw, not 0 or 1. They are not binary in nature. And they are dense representations, as they are therefore called. They're not sparse representations. Yeah. So, earlier people used to use something called as one-hot encodings. Now, one-hot encodings are binary in nature, but unfortunately, they don't carry any semantics. And therefore, people prefer to use these kinds of embeddings, which are not binary. Yeah. And unfortunately, they are not also interpretable. So you couldn't say that, yes, in these 50 dimensions, the first one is for, let's say, length of the word, or second one is part of speech of the word, and so on. So they're not interpretable that way. Yeah, but they work, right? They basically do their job. They give pretty good accuracy and so on. So therefore, people prefer them. Yeah. So moving on to the second part, we have word-to-vec representations. And again, they're super easy to use. You could just download them from this link, as I have done here. We basically have downloaded. This download takes about 5 minutes online. So essentially, this one for me it took like 3 minutes, but sometimes it takes 5 minutes. So depending on your Colab account and I don't know whichever server you've got, whichever machine you got, maybe it can take a little while. Yeah. This is not downloading on your machine, so please don't worry about your machine specifically and the internet connectivity. So don't worry about that. It's downloading on Colab. So that's that. We have downloaded. So these are again pre-trained word-to-vec embeddings which could be used. These word-to-vec embeddings are publicly available. We're just using a public link to download them and use them. They actually contain the vocabulary size is pretty large. So vocabulary size in a few millions. And loading everything is going to screw up your RAM, especially on a free Colab account. And therefore, we are limiting the loading thing to be just 500K of them. We're just loading the most frequent 500K. Yeah. Binary doesn't mean 0 or 1 here. Binary just means that the file format is binary in nature. It's a .bin file, so as to have a compressed format, unlike the glove file, which was more like a text file. Yeah. Again, you could sort of print these embeddings. These embeddings are standard 300 sized embeddings. So they are larger embeddings compared to glove, the glove that we saw, 50 sized one. So they are like 300 sized embeddings. So here is basically how the vector looks like for king. Now, of course, it's not very meaningful, but the most important thing to see is that, yes, it's not 0 or 1. The numbers are pretty close to 0. They could be negative, could be positive, and so on. And again, you could do the same things. You could, for the same set of 11 words, get the embeddings in a small dictionary, try to compute their similarity and see that, yes, the similarity makes intuitive sense. You could also try to reduce the dimensionality to 2 and plot them. And the plots also show similar things. Yes, water, river, ocean are sort of nicely grouped together in a small part. Leaf and tree are very close to each other. Glad and happy are close to each other, which all intuitively make quite some sense. Daughter and mother, king and queen, those groups all make very much intuitive sense. And so that's about word-to-vec. All I'm showing you here is how to basically compute or extract features from your text stimuli. So from pre-trained word embedding models, Yeah. Okay. And then lastly, we have fast text vectors.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Could I ask a question about the earlier part? So, yeah, you see how the happy and glad were similar with the cosine similarity, but I took a look at some other emotion words, and for example, I think joy and sadness was more similar than joy and happiness. So I wonder if there's some is it just because it's so high dimensional, it's considering so many things that it could happen this way?
Yes.
Or there's other kind of similarities that you can use?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So while these work, again, this is natural language processing. Things don't always work 100% of the times. So it's nice. Word-to-vec embeddings are the most primary embeddings. Again, they came up in 2013. Post that, there have been several different ways. So in fact, we talked about glove, which came in 2014, fast text, which came in 2016, and we'll also talk about BERT, which came in 2018, right? So, and then there are more robust embeddings in terms of Roberta and so on, which are way more accurate. Yes, I mean, I'm showing you some cases which work really nicely. In some cases, it doesn't work. However, if you still try to find similar words, right? So if I want to ask, hey, which are the 5 most similar words to joy? I think you will still find pretty good neighborhood. As you said, sadness and joy may not be accurate just because maybe sadness was not frequent enough in the corpus, which was used to pre-train the original word-fit model.
Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Any other quick questions? Thank you. Okay, so if there are no questions, let's keep going. Yeah, so the third part is about fast text, and fast text is again pretty simple. Essentially, you have to download the model. So essentially, I'm just installing wget and downloading the model. This is an English model. Fast text actually is a method which works across many languages. As far as I remember, they have like 100+ languages out there. But again, in the neuroscience world, we are yet to see more languages. We just see like typically English or Japanese and Italian, but probably beyond that, there's not much. Yeah. So once we see more of those things, multilingual embeddings will also become more popular. Yeah. So again, we can actually load this stuff using GenSim. So here I have loaded the fast text embeddings using GenSim package. And then after you have loaded this thing, it more or less works mostly like word2vec. You could actually print the vector for king, and you can do all the kinds of things that we have done earlier. So once you have those vectors, you could get vectors for the 11 words that we had, try to see their similarities, if they make sense or not, and so on. Okay, so that's the first part. Any quick questions that I could take at this point? Any other quick questions? Okay. If there are no questions, then let's basically move to the to the ImageNet world now. And in the ImageNet world, the idea is to be able to take an image and get its embedding somehow, right? Get it some sort of a vector representation. Again, we'll be using pre-trained models. So we'll load the model, we'll load the image, we'll pass the image to the model and get a representation for that image from the model. Okay. Several kinds of such models are available, starting from LXNet, which came in 2012, to VGGNet, ResNet, DenseNet, as you see here, right? So essentially what I've done is to actually list down various kinds of models that are popularly available in the Torch Vision package. So Torch Vision is a popular package which contains all of these image representation models. LXNet, DenseNet, EfficientNet, various models. Okay. So we'll use one of these models. Essentially, we'll use a pre-trained ResNet. But as you will see in the code, you could practically use any of these models and essentially make the code work. Yeah. So ResNet is models. So what is models? Models is a sub-package which is basically imported from Torch Vision. And just like I'm actually trying to create a ResNet 101 model, you can actually create any of these existing models that you see at the top. Okay. Some of these works, we are basically using various kinds of models like Swing Transformer or even LXMERT and so on. So various kinds of models that you see there. So to get a ResNet model, you could basically just say ResNet equal to models.ResNet 101. 101 here stands for 101 layers. So it's the depth of this model, pre-trained equal to true. So you're basically taking a pre-trained model. You could actually print ResNet, and that shows you the architecture of the model. Again, the idea is not to go into the architecture, but just to show you that the architecture contains several blocks along which the entire thing is created. So the overall architecture essentially consists of residual connections. ResNet gets its name from residual connections. And each of this block basically represents a residual block. So a block which actually contains residual connections, essentially comprising of 3 convolution layers, 3 batch norm layers, and so on. Okay. And then, of course, towards the end, there are layers, FC layer, so as to essentially give you a dense representation, a single vector representation of the input image that you would provide. Here I'm essentially just using one of the popular images, our conference logo. So I'm just using the logo and asking it to give me a representation. Okay. So I just downloaded from this link, and I'm just using it. So once I've downloaded the image, I'm actually loading the image. So loading the image and then opening the image. So the way you load the image is using PIL package. The Pillow package is pretty popular, right, for loading the images. I'm doing some basic pre-processing operations which are required because all of these models that are part of the Torch Vision package make use of these pre-processing while training the pre-trained models, right? And therefore, you also need to do this pre-processing when you are trying to test. So we are trying to test, right? We are trying to use these models to come up with a representation, and we therefore must perform the same pre-processing operations that were done while training, which is basically about resizing the image or essentially normalizing the image, or even doing a z-score normalization, basically taking the mean and standard deviation across the RGB frames, and and that's basically the pre-processing operations. Yeah. So once you do the pre-processing operations, we are sort of ready. So we essentially pass the image. We create a batch. See, all of these mechanisms require a batch of instances, and we have only one instance, so be it. Basically, create a batch and pass the batch to the ResNet model. Once we pass the batch, essentially the output that we get essentially is a 1000-sized vector, because the last layer essentially had a 1000-sized output. Right? So that 1000-sized vector is now your representation of the conference logo, which can be basically used for various purposes. For example, to learn a ridge regression model, so as to predict the brain fMRI or the brain responses when somebody saw that logo. Yeah. Okay. So that's that. Now, several of the pieces of work essentially don't just look at the last layer representations, or other people have figured out that representations from some of the internal layers, intermediate layers, are more important. And therefore, there is also more code here to get the representation of an intermediate layer. Yeah. So I may or may not go into the details of this code. Maybe we can. But the idea is that the code base is meant to get, you pick up any intermediate layer, and essentially you can get the output that was generated when the image was passed as input, output that was generated at that intermediate layer. Okay. Any questions so far though on the first part where we just took the output representation? As I mentioned, this was just for ResNet, but there's a whole library of models to try out, and you can basically just get the output representation from any of these models. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, BIT family of the ResNet models include experts models pre-trained on subset of ImageNet. Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing the link, Thomas. Yep. In fact, yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, there are also mixture of experts kind of models, models trained on ImageNet, models trained on object detection kind of mechanisms like RCNN, SSD, YOLO, and so on. Models trained on scenes data set. So models trained on scenes data set. In fact, there are other kinds of models also. So there could be interesting cognitive neuroscience tasks. For example, you could show an image to someone and ask them to imagine the silhouette after 10 seconds, right? And the kind of models that could be interesting there are image segmentation models. Now, of course, I don't see a paper so far which does some such experiments and so on. But there are interesting image segmentation models also which you could try, and you could sort of load the models in the similar way. Yeah. These models are typically available across different libraries. So it's not just that here I'm using PyTorch and therefore using Torch Vision, but you could also use other kinds of libraries like Keras or TensorFlow and so on. And they have their own model zoos, as they call them, where you'll find this repository of models. What's the output of this kind of model? Similarity with a known image? No. The output of these models is a semantic representation of just the image that you passed in. Okay? So it's not a label. It's basically, well, in this particular case, yes, it's one of the 1,000 labels which were a part of the ImageNet task. But what I could do is to really get this 2048 representation, which is a more interesting feature representation, which basically semantically captures the meaning of the image. What is there in the image? For example, people have used these representations in the computer vision world for computing, for coming up with a caption for this image. So if you want to come up with a caption for this image using this vector, then this vector better encode the whatever was there in the image. And people have done other kinds of such tasks using these vectors. It sort of may sound counterintuitive for people who are new to deep learning, but the idea is that yes, in deep learning, people have figured out ways in which you can encode entire text paragraphs or entire images or entire videos in one vector, vector, which is not interpretable. Unfortunately, I can't say that the first feature in this 1,000-sized feature vector is something or whatever, right? I can't interpret it, but it captures the overall, holistically, it captures the meaning of the image. Okay. Any other questions? Any other quick questions? Okay. So if there are no other questions, let me move on to the second part here, which was about getting output from an intermediate layer. So you may not be interested in the last layer, in which case getting the output is a little more tricky rather than just saying, hey, out equal to ResNet of the input image tensor, right? So if you want to get any of those, you would need to do things step by step. There are several kinds of imports which are going on here. There is, there are these model URLs. So essentially, we can actually directly download these pre-trained models. So like ResNet model can be, ResNet 18 can be downloaded from here, 34, 50. So there are these URLs for each of those ResNet kinds. And there are URLs for all of the other kinds as well. So here I've just printed them. You don't need to really remember them. They're actually already a part of the package. But hey, if you are basically, for example, doing torchvision.models.vggnet, then you could get vggnet's URLs and so on. Okay. So once you have that, there's this class which sort of, there's this initialization which is going on, which is defining various kinds of layers. And then there's the forward pass, which basically is taking each of these layers and essentially implementing the forward pass of basically creating the entire architecture of the ResNet model and implementing the forward pass. This particular function is just loading the ResNet model. And again, the model URLs are sort of encoded here so that it knows, it's mentioned as comments here. So from the model, from model URLs itself, it can actually identify what is the right URL given the right architecture as input to the load ResNet function while creating the int ResNet class. Okay, so now to be able to get a particular intermediate representation, all I need to do is to create an instance of this class, a ResNet 50 instance, and I need to say that, hey, I need the output from the layer 4, a particular layer, right? And then essentially, yes, I have to take the model to GPU so that I can actually do the forward pass, get the representation of the layer 4, and then essentially, maybe I can bring it back to CPU and then print it out. So if you look at the overall model, well, this is how the ResNet model looks like. This particular ResNet model, it has various kinds of layers: the convolution layer, ReLU layer, and so on. Multiple of those convolution ReLU layers. And essentially, you can also print the summary in terms of what is the output shape of each of those layers and number of parameters in each of those layers. Again, not too much of interest to neuroscience community, but in case you want to delve deeper into these models, what do they contain, and what would the layer sizes look like, and so on, you can actually look at these parameters and the size of the output. Okay. So this particular model is a 23 million parameter model, just to sort of talk about the number of the size of the model and so on. Okay. So essentially, you can so there we have taken the model to GPU so that we could actually print the summary and so on. Now, if you take the model back to CPU, you could basically say we are using the model in eval mode. You can pass the image tensor, which you had created way back earlier, and then get the layer 4 values. The layer 4 values, yes, you can print the shape, and you can sort of also correlate that this shape actually maps with layer 4. Now, unfortunately, here layer IDs are not here, but if you actually map it, you will be able to see that yes, it sort of maps with the output of layer 4. And the size of the layer 4. Okay, so that's about getting any intermediate representation, intermediate layers representation, and that was for ResNet. Similar stuff you can do for VGGNet. This code from here is for VGGNet, and it's sort of a replica. It's a copy paste of the above code, except that I've modified things to make it work for VGGNet. It's not VGGNet, it's VGG. Yeah, it's just some conventions that people follow. And you can basically just do the same task. So for VGGNet, if you essentially want to, let's say, look at these are all, oh, yes, the architecture differs. So the architecture differs, and therefore creating the VGGNet class is a little different. But the whole point is that if for your work, you just want to use either the VGGNet intermediate layer representations or ResNet intermediate layer representations, you can really copy paste this code and just use it as it is. You don't need to change anything. Yes, if you have to try it out with yet another architecture, then you'll have to come up with your own little code, little changed code here, so as to build the forward pass architecture for architecture for the forward pass for that particular model. But otherwise, for VGGNet and ResNet, you could practically just reuse this code and get the output representation from any of the layers that you're interested in for any image that you're interested in. Okay, so this code is practically making layers, creating the entire architecture. And if you want to now, let's say, get the output from the 7th layer of a VGGNet 11 model, all you need to do is to use this new model class and pass those simple parameters. And finally, what you get is if you pass the tensor, they're essentially telling it to get the 7th layer parameters, essentially get the output from the 7th layer, rather than getting the output representation only. Any questions? So much of this was also taken from these Medium blogs. So I would also want to credit them. So they have also described this process nicely in more detail. So if you also want to read up some sort of lecture notes, you could read them there as well. Any quick questions? Yeah.
Hi, I have a quick clarification question. So are the representations that you're talking about, are you extracting the weights or the activations within the layer, and what are the differences between those sorts of extractions and the representation?
Awesome. So these things that I'm extracting out are activations, the outputs. They are not the weights, right? So why are we not extracting weights? Because getting weights is not very meaningful, right? So from a neuroscience perspective, what do I want? I have an image. I want it's a 1,000-dimensional representation, right? So I don't care whatever weights you use, right? I mean, so as a user, I only care about its representation or its activation. So that is why we are extracting activations. Does that help?
Yes, and then is it the pooling layers, or are you doing is it the convolutions that you're extracting?
Yeah. So it all depends on whatever layer you want to extract out of. So typically people don't extract the things from convolution layer. People typically extract out of after the pooling layer or the last dense layer or the second last dense layer and so on, right? So pooling typically is an activation function for your convolution, which is an integration function. Typically after convolution, people don't extract. Typically they extract after pooling layer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and more specifically, right, in this particular case, the models that we worked with, VGNet, well, again, it's basically a simple convolution pooling kind of a network, but ResNet basically contains blocks, and therefore we're trying to extract out stuff after a particular block. Right? So where a block is defined as a collection of some 3 convolution and 3 pooling layers. Awesome. Any other questions? So yeah, the question scripts are all available in this GitHub link. Yeah, the links are available there. Yeah. Yeah, due to lack of time, I can't really go over every line, although I would find it fun to do that. And again, from a use case perspective, I think people are more interested in how can you use this rather than actually going over every line. Yeah. Okay, so that's that. And lastly, if there are no further questions, lastly, let me just talk about this BERT model. Again, BERT model is pretty easy to use. The Jupyter Notebook may look a little long because, well, we have other things also going on there. But otherwise, it's a pretty simple thing to use. Yeah. I'm trying to use this Jupyter Notebook to basically show to take a BERT model, a pre-trained BERT model, and then fine-tune it on data related to some task. So this is NLP task called as the COLA task. The task is essentially a linguistic acceptability task. So you want to sort of figure out, given a sentence, if it is grammatically correct or not. This is English data. So given a sentence, if it is correct or not. So in this first part here, I'm just downloading that data, so that essentially I have the data, and it's sort of divided also in train and test nicely. So just download the data so that I can nicely fine tune my BERT model on top of that. I'm also installing BERTways, but I don't think I use BERTways here. So yeah, so never mind about the BERTways installation. Even if it fails or give warnings, it's fine, right? I'm installing transformers and TensorFlow. So by default, these should be installed on your Colab environments. But in case you are running this outside Colab, then you would need to install transformers and TensorFlow in those environments. Yeah. And then finally, I'm importing these things. So essentially importing torch, transformers, and some basic Python libraries. Okay. Just checking if GPU is available. So most of you must be very familiar with Colab, but just in case you're not, you could basically ensure that GPU is available. So you could go to runtime, change runtime type, and make sure that you have selected GPU here. GPU or TPU, so one of those two should be available. Please don't select none, because that basically runs the stuff on CPUs, which will take a very long time to run. Right here, it basically just says not a very great GPU, but just a Tesla T4, some GPU is available. Okay. So that's that. Now the task essentially, as I mentioned, it's a linguistic task about basically saying if the sentence is grammatically correct or not. We have the data here. We could load the data using typical pandas. If you load the data, you will see that there are sentences in it and there are labels. Other things are not very meaningful. There are labels and there are sentences, which you could use to fine tune the BERT model. Okay. BERT model expects you to provide input in a format which basically says that the first token must be a CLS classification token, and then there must be a sentence, and then there must be a SEP token to say that yes, this sentence ended here. Yeah. So that's that. Now it could be, so in this particular case, the input could be one sentence, or it could be a collection of sentences, maybe 5 sentences, and you want to figure out if it is grammatically correct or not. And we are separating sentences by the SEP token. Okay. So now this particular part just tells you how to download the pre-trained BERT model. So BERT tokenizer, or rather, basically this is not even downloading the BERT pre-trained model, it's just downloading the tokenizer. Now, interestingly, BERT model by itself does not work on words. So interestingly, the BERT model works on subwords or tokens, as you can call them generically. How to do that, how to basically take your input, which contains words, and create subwords out of it, can be done using BERT tokenizer. So in this part, what we are trying to do is to download the tokenizer and use it on some sample text. For example, if your original text was, our friends won't buy this analysis, let alone the next one we propose. This was the original sentence. And after you tokenize, it sort of becomes like this. CLS, yes, because you have to have a predetermined token called, fixed token called CLS. Friends won't get split into 3 tokens, as you see here, buy this analysis and so on. So you see most of those subwords are really words, but sometimes you will see some of the words like needful, basically, getting separated into need and full separately, and so on. So sometimes those kinds of breaks happen, but many times you see that the entire words are being represented in the vocabulary. Okay, so now that we have done all of that, it's time to sort of process this input a little more before we're ready for using the BERT model, right? So here we have set the mix length to 128. So a BERT model can take up to 128 tokens at the input, right? It can actually, so there's a tokenizer. So for everything in the input, we're going to tokenize it using this simple mapping function, right? Then we are going to, if our input was smaller, right? It's 19, which is smaller than 128. We are going to pad the remaining part using just zeros, so as to create a 128 sized full input, an entire input, which can be sent to a BERT model. We are also creating attention masks. So these attention masks are sort of meaningful, so as to say that, yes, again, I mean, they're more meaningful for the decoding part and not really for the encoding, the deep learning based decoding part and not for the deep learning based encoding part. But we have created them nevertheless because they are really required as part of the input to be supplied to a BERT model. So since we had the data, yes, we divide into train validation split. So we also create train validation test splits, and we also create appropriate data loaders for them. So both to load the actual sentences as well as to load the labels, these are the data loaders being prepared for them. Data loaders basically make sure that you load sentences in a batch by batch form, and we are ready for training the model. So training the model is about, in fact, fine tuning, because we already use the pre-trained model. Now, how do you get the pre-trained model? Just run this code, and that basically gets a pre-trained model from the model repository. Okay. So BERT for sequence classification, which is what we are into right now, and you get the BERT-based uncased model. So BERT-based encased model is a 12-layer BERT model, 12-layer transformer encoder model, which basically does not care about the case. So it is not sensitive to the case. So king with a K capital or a small k is going to mean the same thing. Yeah. And we have 2 labels. Essentially, in this particular case, we are fine-tuning it for grammar correctness. So we have 2 labels as well. This is the architecture of the model. Again, we are not really interested in the architecture too much, but that's basically the 12-layer transform model with a dense layer at the top, so as to predict 2 features out of it. So as to predict 2 classes out of it. So that's basically that. So essentially, if you just have a sentence, and you don't want to fine-tune the model, then you have the model. All you need to do is to pass the sentences in a batch form to this model, just like we did in the previous Jupyter notebook, right? And you essentially get the embedding of the CLS token, which is typically treated as a good semantic representation of the entire input, entire sentence. And you could use it just like that. You may not want to fine-tune it. But if you have data, like we have data here for the grammar correctness task, you could fine tune it as well. Okay? And for fine tuning, you will then need to sort of set up various kinds of things like, hey, what is going to be your different kinds of optimizer? So are you going to use Adam optimizer and then or SGD optimizer or AdamW and so on? And then you have to also specify batch sizes, various kinds of hyperparameters. So essentially, yes, I mean, while you are fine tuning as well, you also need to take care that you can track accuracy so that the fine tuned model doesn't really get overfitted, and essentially you can do early stopping so as to avoid any kind of overfitting. Define a loss as well. So here it's a binary classification problem. So we are going to use binary cross entropy loss, which is what you have defined here, and doing backpropagation. So again, for NLP folks, this is too kiddish, but for neuroscience folks, this could be too much. But the idea is that, yes, you're doing some optimization algorithms just to fine tune this model. And that's popularly called as backpropagation using Adam W optimizer, as we are doing here. Okay. Yeah, so once this optimization gets done, again, you can do it for more epochs. Here in the Jupyter Notebook, we have just shown it for one epoch. So somewhere I think I've set epoch equal to 1. But to get better results, you could actually set epochs equal to 4 or 5 and see better results. But every epoch takes time. So essentially, for example, in this case, one epoch actually took about 2 minutes 33 seconds for me. So you could basically run it for 5 epochs, like 20 minutes or so. You could also plot the progress. So when you are fine tuning it, how did the fine tuning go? So you could plot the progress, and you can see, well, the training loss is decreasing. The trend is to decrease, but this is the practical curve. Well, if you could have smoothed it, if I smooth it out further, you'll see like a decreasing curve. Nice one. And finally, you can of course also do evaluation. So there is evaluation data, which I load as a test loader. I do all kinds of same pre-processing that I did for the training time, add a CLS token, SEP token, and so on. Do the subvert tokenization, or rather the BERT tokenization, put the mask appropriately, saying that, yes, don't try to use the masked out or the zeroed inputs, and essentially create a test data loader out of it, do the evaluation. Here, after doing the evaluation, we sort of observe that, yes, the evaluation goes really well. I think, even while validating, in fact, if you notice, the accuracy was 0.82. When you run, you may get like a little different accuracy, maybe like 0.83 or 0.82 exactly, or rather a little lower, 0.825-ish and so on. But you'll get something in that same range. You get some different results because neural networks have this randomness in them. So sometimes you can get slightly different results as well. Lastly, well, there is some evaluation, but again, this evaluation may or may not matter for your task. This is the COLA task, and it uses something called as Matthews correlation coefficient for evaluation. So evaluate and find that, yes, on the test set, it does nicely. Okay. So that's basically that. Now, how do you use this Jupyter Notebook? The best way to use it is, if you just want to use the pre-trained model, all you need to do is to basically look at this piece of the code where I have loaded the model here. Right? This piece of the code where I've loaded the model. And essentially just pass your input to the model with the SEP token and the CLS token, and get the representation for the CLS token, get the output, basically, get the output and make use of it, right? But if you want to use this, if you want to fine tune on your task, like we did in one of our recent papers, we find it for different NLP tasks. So you could use the entire Jupyter Notebook. That's going to be entirely meaningful for you. If you want to fine tune it on only neuroscience kind of data, where the input is sentences, the output is various kind of response variables, you could use, again, the same Jupyter Notebook. It's just that rather than 2 classes, you would possibly have just one neuron trying to predict the regression value, the magnitude of a particular voxel. And you can then, of course, do it for different voxels separately. Okay, that's how you can use this Jupyter Notebook as well. Okay, so now I'm done and wrapping up. Yep, about to take any questions.